EVO.
By the time Booth got out of bed on April 25th, he had missed breakfast. He was holed up at Richard Garrett's farm near Bowling Green. Garrett's 11-year-old son was tasked with making sure Booth was comfortable and fed. It was then that Booth inexplicably made a very curious decision. He did nothing at all. John Wilkes Booth spent a leisurely day exploring the farm, smoking his pipe, and spending time with the Garrett children. By all accounts, he should have been on the move at first light, making for the train and ensuring his escape. He could be in Mexico in a few days' time, but he didn't. He decided to wait for Davy, thereby completely surrendering the meager head start they had on the New York 16th. Of course, he had no way of knowing that, but he surely would have known that he wasn't far enough south to be out of mortal danger. As it was, Booth was content with enjoying a beautiful spring afternoon while awaiting the return of his friend. He surrendered to the pastoral beauty of the farm, dreaming of another night in a comfortable bed. It was almost as if he never wanted to leave. Welcome back to The Ides of April. I'm Alec Baldwin. Episode 7, To Live and Die in Dixie. Right around the time Booth was sitting down to lunch with the Garrett family, the 16th Cavalry reached Port Conway, Virginia. Immediately upon arrival, Detective Luther Baker spotted a man mending his fishnets on his front porch, William Rollins. Luther asked Rollins if any strangers had passed through recently, men traveling to the port side of the river. Rollins said with the war now over, there had been many unknown men passing through Port Conway in the last 2 weeks. Could he be more specific? Baker asked if any of these men happened to be suffering from a broken leg. The answer from Rollins shocked Detective Baker. Within minutes, Rollins had positively identified both Davy Harold and John Wilkes Booth from photos that the detectives were traveling with. They also carried a third photo, which turned out to be John Surratt. Until that very moment, it was believed that Surratt had been on the run with Booth and Harold the entire time. It would be months before the authorities realized that Surratt had actually been on his way to Europe by this time. Things were serious now. The fugitives were a mere day ahead of the cavalry, time that could easily be made up. But Rollins wasn't done talking. He informed Baker, one of the 3 Confederate soldiers that had joined Booth and Harold seemed to be assisting them. Rollins even knew their names, and that Willie Jett was from Bowling Green. Baker was beside himself, thanking Providence for his good fortune in stumbling upon this kind fisherman with a wonderfully specific memory and a willingness to help. But one more unexpected gift was to be bestowed upon Detective Baker, Mrs. Rollins. The fisherman's wife appeared on the front steps and shared a juicy bit of gossip that one sometimes learns in a ferry town like Port Conway. Willie Jett had a girlfriend, and Mrs. Rollins knew who the young lady was. She happened to live in the hotel operated by her father in Bowling Green. That is surely where Mr. Jett could be found. Lunch at the Garrett table on April 25th included the same guests from the previous evening, minus Mr. Garrett, who was still seeing to business off the property. The topic of discussion was once again the manhunt underway for Lincoln's murderer. Only today, there was some news. The reward had been increased to $170,000, an amount the Garrett children, even the older ones, simply couldn't contemplate. Booth, still playing the role of John Boyd, scoffed. When asked why he thought the number was too high for the perpetrator of such a heinous crime, he corrected the Garrett daughter. He thought it was too low.
I would think it would be $500,000 by now,
he replied. We can imagine his grin, his absolute joy to once again be playing a character and to be hiding in plain sight while getting first-hand information as to how the public viewed him. While the rest of the meal passed without incident, a few seemingly innocuous events over the next 30 minutes would ultimately seal Booth's fate. With the meal completed, Booth retired to the front porch to enjoy his pipe and leisurely await the sunset. John Garrett, one of the recently returned boys from the war, joined Booth on the porch. It wasn't long before the Garrett dogs alerted John that riders were approaching from the direction of Bowling Green. Booth panicked. He ordered John to run upstairs and retrieve his gun belt immediately. Confused, John obliged, but once he reached the upstairs bedroom, he was able to see that the riding party hadn't stopped at the farm, but were continuing on to Port Royal. John returned without the weapons, but with a healthy newfound distrust of their guest. Then, moments later, they could discern someone approaching on foot. Was it a scout, a spy, a sniper? Booth now went into full survival mode. He yelled inside for the youngest Garrett boy, Richard, to get his pistols right away. Scared to death, the 11-year-old did as ordered and returned seconds later with the weapons. John and Richard Garrett watched as Booth hurriedly buckled the belt low on his waist and confidently marched onto the lawn to confront his would-be attacker. But there would be no gunfight. The approaching stranger was not a Union assassin. It was Davy Harold, returning from his night with the soldiers in Bowling Green. Booth introduced Davy as his cousin and announced that they would both be spending the night as guests of the Garretts. But these theatrics and Booth's legitimate fear was enough to plant serious suspicions about the Boyd cousins in the minds of the oldest Garrett boys. Booth and Harold were informed that they were no longer welcome at the Garrett farm. The news was met with more than a little resistance from Booth and Harold. They plainly refused to leave until the master of the house, Mr. Garrett, personally exiled them. As the men were arguing, two riders came galloping up to the Garrett's front gate. The riders happened to be two of their Confederate friends, Ruggles and Bainbridge. They carried incredible news. The cavalry had crossed the Rappahannock to Port Royal and was headed their way. Booth and Harold immediately ran for the woods. They waited silently for several minutes, but no cavalry came. A lone rider passing the farm, however, confirmed to John Garrett that indeed the Union cavalry was on the move toward Bowling Green. Garrett summoned Davy and reiterated his desire for the Boyd cousins to leave the farm immediately. There were children in the house, and the Garrett sons were desperate to avoid any trouble. Just then, the awesome power of nearly 30 horses could be felt in the trembling ground, and the sound of rolling thunder filled the air as the New York 16th arrived and rode right past. With the Garrett family's suspicions now peaking with regard to both the true identity of the Boyd cousins and what they were being hunted for, they were asked to leave immediately. Booth refused until a suitable means of transport to the Orange Courthouse would be guaranteed. John Garrett was so desperate to be rid of these strangers that he offered to take care of it himself, either by carriage or horseback, so long as they left at once. Booth refused. Put at ease by the cavalry rushing past his location, Booth informed John Garrett that they would leave the following morning. In reluctant agreement, John Garrett, still speaking for the family, had one stinging condition. The Boyd cousins were forbidden to enter the house. Infuriated, Booth pled his case, but John Garrett wouldn't be swayed. The tobacco barn, about 200 yards from the main house, was chosen as the night's accommodations. As Booth and Harold settled in, they had no idea that the Garrett boys had quietly locked the barn doors from the outside. The Garretts were certain that their unwanted guests meant to steal their horses and make off in the middle of the night. Booth and Harold were trapped. As the key turned and the tumblers clicked into place, so sealed the fate of John Wilkes Booth. Terry Alford, author of Fortune's Fool, the biography of John Wilkes Booth.
All three seemed to think they were in charge at one time or the other. You would have to say that Conger was, because his military rank was colonel, although he's there as a policeman. The other two were lieutenants. But this is an interesting thing once they get to the farm. I think the soldiers felt a little pushed out of the scene by the detectives, because once they trap Booth in the barn, as I like to think of it, the soldiers are a chainsaw, the detectives are a scalpel.
It was just past 11 on the evening of April 25th when the New York 16th rode into Bowling Green. On the advice of Mrs. Rollins, the men rode directly to the Star Hotel. After gaining entrance and inquiring after young Willie Jett, Baker, Conger, and Doherty led the charge up to the second floor and surprised Jett out of a sound sleep. Almost instantly, Willie Jett betrayed John Wilkes Booth, opting for a promise of anonymity so that he may remain a Southerner in good standing and not face the gallows. He even offered to act as a guide for the cavalry, as the road to Port Royal was difficult to navigate in the dark of night. "The road to Port Royal? We have just come that way," Conger exclaimed. The realization that mere hours earlier they had ridden right past Booth infuriated the detectives. They insisted that Jett prepare himself to leave at once. Booth's Judas, Willie Jett, did as promised and led the cavalry directly to the Garrett farm. More of the Ides of April after the break. It was nearly 3 a.m. on April 26, 1865. It may have been the familiar staccato of galloping horses or the barking of the Garrett dogs. Either way, Booth woke with a start and immediately knew he and Davy were in grave danger. Unaware that the fugitives were safely locked in the tobacco barn, Conger ordered the house to be surrounded while he pounded on the front door. A groggy Richard Garrett was not giving clear answers as to the location of the strangers who were guests of his farm. The senior Garrett told the officers that the men they were looking for had gone into the woods and started a rambling story that Conger had no patience for. He threatened to hang Richard Garrett from a locust tree. Garrett may very well have obliged them, had his son John Garrett not arrived on the front porch and offered the exact information Conger and his men were looking for. John Garrett led Conger, Baker, Doherty, and the entire cavalry to the tobacco barn where John Wilkes Booth and Davy Herold were helplessly imprisoned. Inside the barn, Booth and Herold had tried in vain to break the lock that prevented their escape. Through force, they attempted to loosen one of the boards along the back wall of the barn. Again, they were met with failure.
The detectives are a scalpel. So what do you want to do? Just shoot everyone in the barn? Or do you want, to maybe pry him out of there, talk him out of there, tell him, come out, we won't kill you, you'll be okay? And so the detectives took over the conversation with Booth once they realized who they had there.
Once the barn was surrounded, Conger made an interesting choice. He demanded that John Garrett, an unarmed civilian, enter the barn and disarm Booth and Herold. His reasoning? Booth knew John Garrett and was more likely to listen to him. Also, they were scared. It was a completely dark barn, and Booth was a known killer. The chances he might take a shot at a Union soldier from a concealed location were very high. As such, Conger calculated that a familiar voice in the barn was less likely to draw fire, and if it did, John Garrett would be acceptable collateral damage. The plan fell short. Once in the barn, Garrett announced himself and his intentions. On the orders of the cavalry, he was to confiscate Booth's weapons. This request was met with a hiss from the shadows. Booth cursed him for a coward and demanded he leave immediately or be shot. Conger wasn't taking his command authority seriously. It was 2 men against 26 fully armed cavalry soldiers, along with Baker and Doherty, and yet they did nothing. They waited. They hesitated. A full assault on the barn would have been chaotic in the dark, of course, but they would have been successful. Instead, they tried to negotiate a peaceful surrender by way of threats. Detective Luther Baker lobbed the opening salvo. "Surrender, or I will burn this barn down in 15 minutes." The gamesmanship between Booth and the detectives had begun. Booth demanded to know who was speaking, as he still was genuinely unsure if they were friend or foe. Realizing this advantage, Conger made sure no definitive answer was given. Booth tried again.
This is a hard case. It may be that I'm to be taken by my friends.
Baker maintained his negotiating position. "It doesn't matter who we are. We know who you are, and we are here to take you both prisoner."
Not mentioned at the time, but I think in Booth's head. In 1859, he had been present at the execution of John Brown, the abolitionist, right, who was hanged in Charlestown, now West Virginia. He had seen a hanging. He had seen a hanging up close. He had no intention of being hung after being gawked at and tried and stared at. And, he just decided, I'm going to go out on my own terms. I'll either shoot myself, which he had already told somebody he would do if he had to. I'll either shoot myself or I'll try to fight it out of here. He did want, even when he and Harold went in the barn, he wanted to escape. He and Harold went to the back of the barn. They tried to push a board out so they could slip out and get into the woods. He didn't have any death wish, right? He just intended not to be hanged. And I think he would have come out and started shooting. In fact, that's an interesting point about Booth. It was very dark in the barn, and as daylight began to break, he could see the soldiers. He could have easily shot 2 or 3 of them if he wanted to. But as one of the detectives said, he doesn't seem to have had any desire to shoot us, right? He had shot the person he wanted to shoot. That was it. And having no options, he wouldn't come out. They parlayed endlessly. They really did try seriously to talk him out of the barn. They couldn't get him out. So they just set the barn on fire, try to flush him out. And at that point, he had to make a decision. He had nowhere to go but out that barn door. And the soldiers were out there.
All the while, Booth was holding a simultaneous conversation with Davy Harold. Davy was finished. He honestly believed he had done no wrong. He had harmed no one. It was Booth with the gun and Powell with the knife. What crime had Davy committed? All he'd done was help a wounded friend make his way home. Surely there was no harm in that. He pleaded with Booth to allow him to surrender. Booth refused again and again. But Davy had no interest in a gunfight and even less interest in being burned alive. He persisted until Booth relented. But ever the narcissist, Booth had to make it his idea.
You damn coward! Will you leave me now? Go! Go! I would not have you stay with me.
Despite his anger, Booth was able to find a lingering shred of humanity when it came to Harold's surrender. Booth called out to the authorities that there was indeed a man who wished to give himself up. Captain Doherty chimed in now, demanding that whomever was about to exit the barn needed to relinquish his weapons first. Davy responded that he had none, but Doherty pushed again. "Hand out your arms and you can come out." Davy Harold, near tears, mumbled his reply. "I have no arms. Let me out." Again, the incompetence of those in command shines through here. They were on the threshold of victory. Lincoln's assassin was within reach, and here they were arguing with a man willing to surrender. Even if he did have a concealed weapon, how much damage could he have done? In the dark, outnumbered nearly 30 to 1, of all people it was Booth who stepped in as the adult in the room.
Upon the word and honor of a gentleman, this boy has no arms. The arms are mine, and I've got them all.
I own all the arms, and I intend on using them on you gentlemen.
Booth then reminded the officers that they were missing the point.
There is a man in here who wants to come out.
And this is where the desperate charade of Davy Harold began. Yes, let me out, I know nothing of this man. Davy would make the same claim multiple times, that he had no idea who Booth was, and it would seem that Booth was on board when he stated,
Let him out! That young man is innocent!
Harold came out and was taken into custody, still claiming ignorance of the man left inside the barn. Only Booth was left. How would his final act play out?
But remember, he's got a broken leg. He can hardly move around. He has a crutch, a broken leg, a rifle. He tries to throw a table on the fire. That doesn't snuff it out. It was a wooden barn with slats, which just added oxygen to the fire, and hay stored in there. It was just a perfect combustible situation.
The lack of a clear leader had already become apparent several times in the early morning hours of April 26th, and presently another disagreement commanded the attention of Baker, Conger, and Doherty. When do we strike? Doherty wanted to wait until morning, while Baker and Conger wanted to move against Booth right away. Doherty was reminded that Booth had a Spencer rifle. Once the sun was up, Booth would be able to pick off soldiers one by one. Dawn was the enemy of the operation, and that argument would win the day. It was during this discussion between the command triumvirate that Lieutenant Doherty was presented with an incredible offer. The offer was from a sergeant within the ranks of the 16th, a decidedly curious fellow named Boston Corbett. Sergeant Corbett offered the following. He would enter the barn, alone, fight Booth man to man, and deliver him to justice. Should he be bested by Booth, well then, that would have required a gunfight, and while the fugitive was reloading, the rest of the cavalry forces could storm the barn and apprehend Booth before he could get another shot off. The absurd offer was quickly rejected. But Sergeant Corbett felt the need to make the offer 2 additional times before he was ordered to stand down and rejoin the ranks surrounding the barn. But that's not where Corbett's story ends. Detective Conger was through waiting. He called on the Garrett boys to gather kindling and prepare to burn the barn. Edwin Stanton, who was still oblivious to the events at the Garrett farm, wanted Booth alive, and this course of action was determined to give the best odds of achieving that. Booth wouldn't choose to burn, no. He had an even grander, more theatrical, some might even say Shakespearean idea of how this all would end. Booth, realizing that the barn was being prepped to burn, addressed Detective Baker personally with his astonishing offer.
Captain, I have but one leg. If you will withdraw your men in line 100 yards from the door, I will come out and fight you.
Today we call this suicide by cop, but to Booth it was an honorable, even gentlemanly solution to their predicament. Booth wouldn't be taken alive. He had already come to that decision, and this would guarantee him what the Spartans called a beautiful death. One man, hobbled and in pain, challenging nearly 30 armed men to a fight to the death. If Booth was trying to cement some kind of legacy, it worked. We're still talking about it more than 150 years later. But Baker refused the offer. He implored Booth that they hadn't come for a fight, they wanted him as a prisoner. Booth persisted with his challenge, even offering to reduce his advantage to 50 yards. This was also rejected. He couldn't think that officers of the U.S. military would seriously consider, much less allow, soldiers to participate in what would amount to a duel with a civilian target. Regardless, the time for a negotiation was over. The barn was set ablaze, and the soldiers readied for action. They had strict instructions. Booth was to be taken alive. If and when the shooting started, the men were instructed to wound, not to kill. As the fire grew, it afforded the soldiers surrounding the barn sudden access to their sense of sight. They could finally see Booth through gaps in the boards of the barn. He had his rifle in one hand, pistol in the other, and a crutch under his arm. He looked around desperately, trying to decipher where the greatest danger would come from. Boston Corbett was the first to raise his weapon and draw a bead on Booth, but held his fire. No one quite knew what to expect. Would Booth decide to drop his weapons and surrender? Would he come out shooting, possibly die in a hail of bullets? Or would he succumb to the smoke and flames? As Booth made his way to the front door of the barn, trying to get a look at what awaited him, Boston Corbett kept him in his sights. And then, according to Corbett, Booth began to raise his rifle and, sensing that his fellow soldiers were in imminent danger, Corbett fired.
So he turned, he faced the door, ran his hand through his hair to kind of smooth it back, and he took about a half step toward the door, and he was shot right through the neck by one of the soldiers who was peeking in. Boston Corbett, a Union soldier who had been in the war since the very beginning. He was an immigrant to the United States from England, but lived in Boston. He was a very curious guy. He himself had been captured during the war and went to the infamous Andersonville prison. So he had a taste of Southern hospitality, if I could put it that way, right? And, he was determined to be the avenger of Lincoln. Early in the war, Lincoln had shaken his hand. When Lincoln thanked the soldiers, among others, Lincoln had shaken his for coming down and rescuing the Capitol. And Corbett said, I wanted God to make that hand the one that avenged his death. So without orders, without pretext, without immediate provocation, Booth was dangerous, no doubt. But he wasn't on the point of shooting somebody. It wasn't like a shootout, old cowboy shootout in the street. Booth was beginning to make his way as best he could toward the door.
The bullet entered Booth's head in a remarkably similar location to where his own entered Lincoln's. Just below the left ear, between the ear and the spine. The bullet tore a radically different, though equally fatal path. Perhaps redirected by the base of the skull, the bullet adopted a downward trajectory. Then it severed the cervical spinal column and decimated the vocal cords, muscle, and surrounding tissue before exiting out of the front of his neck. Instantly paralyzed, Booth crumpled to the floor. Hearing the shot, the detectives rushed into the burning barn. Immediately, they began accusing each other of shooting Booth. They disagreed about whether or not Booth committed suicide. Lieutenant Doherty followed quickly with Davy Harold to get a positive ID. But true to the only story that could save his life, Harold claimed not to know the man dying on the floor. Amidst the growing flames, Baker and Conger used the photo of Booth that they had in their possession. Despite the missing mustache, they were able to identify John Wilkes Booth beyond any doubt.
The family came out to try to make him comfortable. He was initially just taken out of the barn, but then the barn turned into inferno, so they had to move him again to the porch of the Garrett house. He was on there for about 2 hours or so before he finally passed away. The difficulty was, he had lost the ability to breathe normally, so he could only kind of breathe by gasps, and he slowly began to asphyxiate, really. That's what happened to him. He couldn't keep his breath. And, he was able to say a few things, but you had to put your ear right to his lips to hear what it was.
With the barn now fully engulfed in flames, the cavalry fell back to the Garrett house. Booth was placed on the front porch and attended to by the Garrett housekeeper, Lucinda Holloway. Though he could barely speak and was in tremendous pain, Detective Conger was right by his side to record any statement he might make that could be included in the final report for Secretary Stanton. With great difficulty and never rising above a coarse whisper, Booth uttered,
"Tell Mother I die for my country."
With Booth's words faithfully recorded for posterity, it was now Conger's desire to find out who fired the shot that would ultimately prevent him from returning to Washington with Booth still alive. He didn't have to go far. Almost instantly, Sergeant Corbett presented himself and confessed, claiming, "Providence directed me." This was the story that Corbett would stick to until the end. He didn't intend on killing Booth, just to wound him, and to prevent any of Corbett's fellow soldiers from being killed. He was also sure to point out that no orders were given that the men should hold their fire. While Booth's personal effects were being collected by Detective Conger, Lucinda Holloway gently cradled his head in her lap. Miss Holloway remarked that his face was luminous, and the pleasantness of his appearance was only increased when the first rays of the breaking dawn upon him. It was not unlike the scene with Silas Cobb on the Navy Yard bridge remembering the eyes and white hands of Booth, or how Thomas Jones fawned over Booth's appearance in the woods of Maryland. Booth was a dying man, suffering and bleeding out. Yet what remained most remarkable about him was his face. That always seemed to be what people remembered most after an encounter with John Wilkes Booth. As the sun fully cleared the eastern horizon on April 26, 1865, Booth momentarily rallied and had a brief whispered exchange with Lucinda that would confound historians for generations. "My hands," he whispered, not knowing the reason Lucinda raised Booth's hands in front of his face so he could see them one last time. What was the importance of his own hands? It wasn't made clear then, and is even less clear today. What's more, Booth's reaction to seeing his own hands did little to clarify.
Useless. Useless.
Is it possible that in his final moments Booth realized that despite his passion and willingness to do what others would not, his grand performance and Shakespearean finale were ultimately useless not for the North and certainly not for Lincoln? Booth's actions had the opposite effect of what he had hoped for. Lincoln's assassination was a moment that galvanized a nation as it navigated the waters of a new dawn in the American experiment. As for the South, a previously unheard-of posture of supplication was necessary as the country moved into Reconstruction. And because of Booth's actions, the prevailing attitude towards the Confederacy was, in terms understood by those of Southern persuasion, that they had acted with unforgivably bad manners. For John Wilkes Booth to reduce his beloved Dixie to such a station is an outcome he could never have imagined. That, however, is his true legacy. Not creative genius nor Shakespearean master, not a proud descendant of immigrants who made the most of the American dream, not a loyal brother or dutiful son, and certainly not a Southern patriot who took defeat like a gentleman and aided his vanquished country through the difficult post-war years. All of which could easily have been true for Booth. Instead, we get American villain, American Brutus, a cowardly murderer who shot an unarmed man from behind and fled into the night, ruining the lives of those men who put their faith in him, all to try and claim a victory whose defeat was already made certain, and in doing so only steel the resolve of his enemies, a resolve that persists to this day. For the countless performances that Booth gave as Hamlet, the melancholy Dane, it's interesting to consider that one of the bard's many lessons was either missed or ignored. For as useless as his actions were, Booth was indeed hoisted upon his own petard. On our final episode, we explore the aftermath of the Lincoln assassination, the trial, the ultimate fate of the conspirators, and what became of Stanton, Seward, and the rest of the Union leadership. And finally, how Reconstruction would alter our lives and our laws to this very day. That's next week on The Ides of April. The Ides of April was created, produced, and written by Brandon Morgan. Our executive producers are Brandon Morgan and Matt Del Piano. Zach McNeese is our story editor, sound designer, and mixer. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thanks for listening.